Thank you so much for having me come speak. Really excited to be here. Let John kick it off really well. I can tell you when we get to my bio a little bit about my story and kind of how I got to where I was, but I think I definitely took a non-traditional route, and there's definitely, there's nothing wrong with, like John was saying, knowing what you really want to do and then going after it, despite the fact that most people are telling you that that's not really necessarily the way you should go. As an undergraduate, I got a degree in biochemistry, and then I always wanted to go to medical school, and got into medical school, and was in medical school, and hated medical school. But who leaves medical school, right? And so I decided I wanted to leave, and because nutrition was really what I wanted to do. And I remember I was at the University of Vermont, and I emailed, just looked her up on the web, a professor who was the head of the department there, and I said, I'm a medical student. Thinking about leaving, could I come talk to you? So this woman, didn't know me from anything. And she let me come to her office, and I sat down, and I was like, I don't want to go to medical school anymore. I want to be a nutritionist. What does that mean, and how do I do it? And, she spent an hour and a half with me, kind of, clarified for me exactly what that meant, what I should do. All I knew was I love nutrition, and I love science, and I wanted to make something out of it. And so I ended up leaving medical school and going to my PhD in nutrition. So I think you guys are in a great place in your life, and right now you can literally do anything you want. So as you go and do it, if you find yourself down one path, no matter how long you've committed to it, if it's not really what you want to do, feel free to get off and do something else. Because I think people thought I was crazy leaving medical school, and but I wouldn't have made that. I wouldn't have changed that decision now for anything. But so today I want to talk about optimal protein strategies for fat loss and performance. Feel free to raise your, except for Lee Schuler, feel free to raise your hand during the talk, ask a question. The first time I ever gave a talk, Lou was in the audience, and like 5 minutes into the presentation, he raised his hand like every 10 minutes. Anybody but Lou can ask questions during the presentation. I want to thank the New York State Food Council is sponsoring unbelievable the benefits of protein, and it's not just for meatheads, literally. So what are we going to talk about today? So today, this is in no particular order, kind of an aggressive schedule, so I'm going to go maybe a little bit fast, but still feel free to interrupt. Talk about protein intakes. We're going to talk about protein's effects on body composition, health benefits of increased protein intake. This is just fascinating effect of exercise on protein synthesis and protein metabolism. We'll talk about protein synthesis and then also protein myths. I thought the protein myths thing was going to be pretty good because you probably have textbooks that say these myths. Because I know I have one in my office, I forgot to get it. I have an intro nutrition textbook that literally spells out the myths that I'm going to talk about as fact. So that's kind of an ironic piece. But when we talk about optimization, I think that one thing to think about throughout this whole presentation is that optimization is really relative to where you are. And when approaching nutrition with anything, it's all about change, and the changes you make are really relative to where you start. So I have a client who will literally have Snickers or Skittles for lunch, right? And first I was like, people actually do that, and second, that's horrible. I mean, he's a very educated, successful guy, and he eats Snickers and Skittles for lunch. So for him, there's a huge spectrum of change for him. It's great, right? Like, let's have a sandwich instead. So how we optimize something is very relevant. If you're already having, some sort of lunch with lean proteins and lots of vegetables, maybe then we're looking at protein timing or other ways to optimize. But there's really a spectrum of optimization, and it's really important dealing with someone that you're kind of looking at the individual and what they're doing and how we can change with regards to where they are, not necessarily with respect to the ideal. So let's get started with protein myths. So some great facts that you will still hear about higher protein diets, that they'll damage your kidneys, they'll damage your liver, and they'll also hurt your bone health. So they literally leach calcium out of your bones. Just kind of makes me so let's kind of go over these things. So eating more protein will damage your kidneys. I just want to make sure I know what's going to do. Okay. So this is one of the big ones that's, if you guys have nutrition textbooks, it's definitely in your textbook, that it's going to damage your kidneys. And the thought being that a high-protein diet increases the stress on your kidneys. And stress is an interesting topic or an interesting concept because you need stress, right? All you lift weights, all weightlifting is stress, but it's the titrated stress, right? And so it's the same thing. I don't know, all of a sudden our kidneys became these fragile organisms or organs that weren't allowed to adapt to anything. But what the research really shows is that moderate changes in dietary protein cause adaptive alterations in your kidneys, right? In renal size and function without the indication of adverse effects. So just like when you go to the gym and you lift and your muscles withstand that stress, they get broken down and then they build up stronger so that they adapt to that stress. When you increase your protein intake, as long as you have healthy kidneys, only that change is just an adaptation, right? And so it's not hurting your kidneys, they're just adapting so they can function better. The other one is that eating more protein will damage your liver, right? So that's another big danger of eating more protein. And this is really a misguided chicken or egg type argument, right? So that people who have liver disease, right, have trouble with higher protein diets because of the metabolism that goes on with your liver and protein. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a normal functioning liver, that you're going to have problems processing protein. There's really no evidence to show that people with normal livers, and it's not Saturday night, so I assume everyone's liver is functioning normally at the moment. But that your liver is functioning fine, the protein's really not going to have any sort of effect. And then the last one is that eating more protein will cause osteoporosis. So that eating more protein is bad for your bones. And this can be scary because your body's only really good at packing away and strengthening your bones at a certain part of your lifespan, and then once you're in your kind of late to early 30s, then it's kind of all downhill from there. And resistance training is the thing to help keep it strong. So if protein is going to help increase your risk of osteoporosis and leach calcium out of your bones, that would be a problem. But there's no evidence to show that high protein intake per se is detrimental to bone strength or mass. And it's really because it's a lot more complicated relationship where there is no quantifiable relationship in healthy individuals. But what scientists think, so what they're kind of hypothesized, is that you would need to increase your protein intake about 2.5 times greater than the upper range of what's considered acceptable. And then you would also need to reduce your calcium intake to about half. So you need about 600 milligrams of calcium per day. So you need this very high, unnecessarily high protein intake and a very, very low calcium intake to then maybe be at risk for this. So it's really not an issue for just about everyone. So key points from this section on myths is there's no evidence to show negative health effects of a healthy person eating more protein. So we talk about eating more protein, and the question is, well, how much more protein, right? And this is a great discussion. I'm not a dietitian, but I spend a lot of time with dietitians, educating dietitians about protein, and so when protein comes up, the response is that you need the RDA, right? Or the RDA for protein. And so we'll talk about that. And what that means, but when we talk about protein, it really comes into what's optimal. So this is looking at malnutrition. This is looking at optimal for your health. And I think this is also looking at exercise and performance. So when we take all those things together, then that's really optimal protein intake. Where generally people just look at RDA. So now let's explore a little bit the difference between required and optimal. So the recommended dietary allowance for protein, right, or the RDA. And so the RDA is defined as, and this is the RDA for basically anything, the average daily dietary nutrient intake level sufficient to meet all nutrient requirements in nearly all healthy individuals in a particular life stage or gender group. So basically, when they come up with this number, I'll just make it up, but when the number is formed, they'll say, what is the amount of protein that we would need to recommend for, almost everyone, so 97, 98% of the population, so that if they ate that, they would be healthy, right? Because everybody's on a bell curve, so they want to be on the far side of the bell curve to just to make sure everyone's covered. And that's where the RDA comes in. So it's really about preventing deficiencies, preventing essential amino acid deficiencies. Not really a problem for us in today's age, much more of a problem when they first started coming up with these around World War II, and then when everything was needed to be rationed. So they're basically like, well, what is the least amount of protein we can feed our population so they don't, become protein malnourished, so we can send them, as much food as possible overseas. Now, what's really interesting is within the scientific community, this past October I was invited to an amazing event in Washington, D.C. called the Protein Summit, where they basically gathered 50 or 60 of the top protein researchers in the whole world, and they had a day-and-a-half event just talking about protein. It was amazing. It was amazing in like a science nerd type amazing way. But so these scientists got up, and one of the things that they were recommending is that we change literally the verbiage of the RDA because it's misleading, and instead call it the recommended minimum intake, because it's really looking at preventing deficiency. And the way that it's described, it makes people think that's the most amount of protein you should eat. So the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, which, despite having been in science my whole life, grams and kilograms, it still makes me very confused. So if you translate that, for the average woman, it's about 46 grams per day of protein, and for the average male, it's about 56 grams per protein. Or it's probably, a snack for Tony Gentlecore. It's not, it's 46 grams, 2 scoops of protein, and you're pretty much there. So that brings us to another idea that goes along with the RDAs called the AMDRs. I'll try not to get crazy with the acronyms, but these are important ones. So the AMDR stands for Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range. And so this is defined a little bit different. It's defined as a range of intakes for a particular energy source associated with reduced risk of chronic disease while also providing adequate intakes of an essential nutrient. So basically what scientists did with the AMDRs is instead of saying this is how much you need to prevent deficiencies, they said, well, at the low end you need this, so you're not deficient. And then at the high end, we know there are no adverse effects at this upper level, right? We could probably go higher, we know for sure. I would say, we throw this way, but I'm guilty of using them. I'm trying not to. It's like sometimes magazine editors trick you into saying them. You're like, oh, why did I say it? Fat-free foods, I think, is kind of stupid because aside from, green tea and chili peppers, right? Foods don't actually burn fat. Maybe they are less caloric than other foods, thus you burn fat, but there's no real fat burning foods. Healthy fats is another phrase that I cringe now when I hear it, because aside from industrial trans fats, right, which is like the trans fats and hydrogenated oils that we use in margarines and stuff, you could essentially make a case that any fat is healthy, right? Even if you just said trans fats, like CLA, which is in dairy products, is supposedly healthy. The phrase the Atkins diet drives me crazy because I feel like people don't actually have a concept of what that really means. They attribute it to this high protein diet, but really ketogenic diets aren't that high in protein, they're more very high in fat. So the phrase Atkins diet. And then high protein. I think high protein is really bad because high relative to what? Right? It's a very nondescript term. And this is a really good example of how high gets us in trouble. So if you look at the bars show average intakes across different age groups for protein on a percent calorie basis. Protein's a little confusing because people go back and forth between percent calories and grams per pound body weight. And I think that's just part of the confusing part of protein. But if you look here, the AMDRs, right, are set by the small blue bar, so the low and the high upper range. Right? That's actually should be 35%, the upper range. And then, so you can see that we're all, across the life cycle, basically eating around 15% of total calories. So if you're eating 15% of total calories, and we're looking optimal is going to be somewhere between 20 to 25, or maybe even 25 to 30, right? You're going to need, almost in some cases, need to double your protein intake, right? And so higher protein, if you say a high protein diet, for someone who's eating 12% of their calories from protein, double your protein intake is going to be high, but relative to your total diet, it's not very high, and it's still well within the acceptable range. So I think more appropriate is a moderate protein intake, what most people would call high. High just kind of sets off these like scary bells. So I think moderate protein is more appropriate. So that's why I think you can kind of get rid of high protein. So the keys really to this section, AMDRs are set to prevent deficiencies, or RDAs are set to prevent deficiencies, and AMDRs give us a safe range to customize our diets within. So let's look at now some optimal protein intakes. One of the most interesting areas of protein is protein with respect to heart health. Because for the longest time, no one really paid attention to protein. But the dietitian is it dampens those areas of your brain that derive that reward-driven stimulus. So from a neurological level, you're actually not as turned on by pizza and cookies and things like that. It's amazing. So that puts us at around, the magic number for this is around 25 to 30% of calories in your diet, right? Or at least about 30 grams per meal. So now let's move into protein, exercise, and recovery. So despite that, my whole career has really been based into nutrition, I have the utmost respect for exercise. Exercise is the most amazing drug you have access to. Think food is a drug, but more in a negative sense, like heroin. And exercise is a drug more in a positive sense, like caffeine, right? Because caffeine is a great drug. So exercise is this amazing drug that has this great impact on your physiology, and especially with respect to protein synthesis. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I'm so excited, I'll just tell you now. You could be a sedentary old person. So basically, you have the most anabolic resistance you could imagine. And you go for a 10-minute walk before your meal, and then your anabolic response to a protein meal is you're at 25 point. It's amazing. Exercise's ability to kind of reset the clock on protein metabolism is just fascinating. So how does this work? So basically, leucine, which is an essential amino acid, branched chain amino acid, that's present at about 8%. If you look at a scoop of a piece of beef or a piece of chicken, about 8% of that is leucine. And so leucine goes in and stimulates this cellular mechanism, specifically mTOR, and then mTOR activates protein synthesis. And that's kind of the magic of protein synthesis. And what researchers have found is kind of exploring this whole leucine mTOR thing is that there needs to be some sort of fluctuation. I can't remember if I have a slide on it, so I don't want to talk about it now. Okay, good. So there needs to be some sort of fluctuation in your blood amino acid levels to maximize this stimulus, this protein synthesis. When we talk protein synthesis, we're talking about muscle protein synthesis. So essentially putting amino acids together to build muscle. And and I'll read, the first person to raise my hand is guilty of doing this. Has anybody taken a jug, a gallon jug, filled it with water, and then added to that whey protein or branched chain amino acids, and then sipped it throughout the day? It's okay, right? Yes, all right. So, right, because that's what you do, because you got to be anabolic all the time, right? And what happens is, I guess when you make decisions based on what supplement companies tell you should do, it doesn't lead to good physiological responses. So what we've actually found is that having your blood amino acid levels elevated 24/7 because you want it to be anabolic all the time, right? We just got to get a t-shirt slogan somewhere, is actually a negative thing. And what you need is fluctuations in your blood amino acid levels. Your muscles essentially need to rest. And this is called the refractory period, which we'll talk about in a second. And so I just want to kind of keep that in mind as we talk. You need these ups and downs of your protein intake. Now, back to how an average American eats. So this is, unfortunately, probably pretty accurate, right? And these numbers, the grams, I don't think those chicken fingers are 63 grams of protein, but the intakes are true. So Americans, 19 years old plus, this is what their protein distribution looks like. 11 grams at breakfast, and the 11 grams in this situation is purely bad. Good thing a lot of people add milk to their coffee, because otherwise they'd get no protein at breakfast. But 11 grams at breakfast, 16 grams at lunch, and then 63 grams at the end of the day. So we have this very skewed protein distribution. So then these researchers down at the University of Texas Galveston, the medical branch down there, who are very interested in protein synthesis, were asking this question: well, how does that work for us? You know, where is this threshold for protein synthesis? Like, if you eat 10 grams of protein at breakfast, does that actually help you, or does it not? So they did this study, and the guy who did this study is Dr. Hedden Jones, and he's like never someone you want to be on the same speaking ticket with, because he's probably like, he's 6 feet tall, and he's lean, and he has this Australian accent. And so, he does research for NASA. So he's like this really like slick and like going after Doug, and you're like chopped liver. But he's a really nice guy. So he does this really fascinating research with protein synthesis, partly because he does work with NASA, so they're interested in these astronauts are up there, without gravity, how's that impacting muscle loss? And then he also does a lot of work with people on bed rest. So if you're on bed rest, right, you're essentially, that's how they mimic the gravity-free environment. What's happening there. So he's very interested in protein synthesis from that standpoint. So how can we use, essentially just taking the same amount of protein that people are eating, and what if we change around what they're doing? Does that impact protein synthesis? So what they did was they wanted to look at, they basically gave people a bunch of hamburgers, right, say 90 grams of protein, or they gave them 30 grams of protein. And they wanted to see what was the difference in protein synthesis. So basically what they found was there was a 46% increase in protein synthesis with both groups. So regardless of whether you ate 30 grams of protein or 90 grams of protein, you got the same bump in protein synthesis. And this got people thinking again about this threshold, that there's a minimum and also kind of a maximum amount of protein that you can't do any more protein synthesis. And so that's with 30 grams, and so when you translate that into Lucy, like math and amino acids like I do, that's around 2.5 or maybe 3 grams of leucine. So then what they did, and I apologize, this is definitely the busiest slide that I have, but they said, well, let's put that in context of how people actually eat, right? So they took that same breakdown, breakfast 11 grams, lunch 16 grams, dinner 63 grams, and then they said, let's take the same amount of protein and just distribute it better. Because if we know from that first study that whether you eat 30 grams or 90 grams, you get the same bump in protein synthesis, let's just redistribute what people are eating to more of this even distribution, 30, 30, 30. And what they found was that when you do that over the course of the day, you get a 25% increase overall in protein synthesis. So it's like you're eating the same food, but just in a different time pattern, a different time span, and you get this great increase in protein synthesis. So this, I think, is really amazing, because it's not even eating more. It's just take what you're doing and spread it out. Doug calls it, getting away from the absurd, being how we normally eat, being the absurd. So getting away from the absurd, just kind of redistributing it differently, and you can get this great effect. So this, you're like, well, what does that even mean, 25%? So if you ask him, he really thinks that as we get older, if you're not active, around 35 years old, you start to lose muscle, right? Maybe at a rate of about 1% lean body mass per year on average. He thinks that this 25% increase is enough to completely wipe that out, right? So that's pretty significant. If you think about it, just taking what you're doing and changing it a little bit, that you can wipe out that age-related decrease in protein synthesis. And so I think for us, I'll say this collectively, not meatheads, right, for myself, and not as strong as John, I can throw some weight around, that that this is a great advantage as well, that once we spread out our protein intake, we get greater increases in protein synthesis. So we've given this limit of how much muscle we can build, and this is kind of a way to hack that limit. And then, so I mentioned this refractory period before, and this is why we need kind of these spikes in protein synthesis, because there's some sort of resetting at the molecular level that has to occur. Like the muscles need a break, just like if you're running intervals, like you need a downtime. And so a refractory period is a delay in response to the second of two closely spaced physiological stimuluses. So it's like amino acids, and then your body needs a break, and then you can hit it with more amino acids. The one caveat to this, I don't have a slide on that, is that essential amino acids, like in a drink, seems to allow you to stimulate protein synthesis sooner. So normally it's going to be like a 4-hour window or so. That there's one study that looked at giving an amino acid drink, an essential amino acid drink, at the 2-hour mark, and they were able, and it didn't interfere with the next meal. So you can kind of double down on your protein synthesis with that. How, like, what does that effect turn into, like, from a real perspective? Not really sure. I think if you're, like, really committed, it could be something to try. But for, like, the kind of, I would say, like, an average person, it's probably not worth it. There are a lot of other behaviors we want to correct first. Yeah, you had a question?
Does that have to do with macronutrient distribution of just taking in the leucine by itself? So when you're taking it, let's say you're taking in 7 grams of branching amino acids, about 5 of that is leucine. Mm-hmm. And now you're taking it in the supplement, so you're not taking in the fat and carbs. Does that impact how it's absorbed?
Yeah, so I think that's why I think it works, is it's a speed of absorption and like a speed of, so if you just basically taking a free-form liquid amino acid, like it's in quick, it causes a quick rise, rise and fall in your blood amino acid levels, and to give you that spike. And that's probably why it works. Whereas if you're taking it as part of the whole meal, the curve is a lot greater and slower. So when we look at protein timing, it's really, you're going to want to spread this out more than you would think. When you talk about eating 6, 7,